Good morning, good afternoon, and
Good evening.
welcome to R.W.A. Radicals with Age. My name is Jesse.
And my name is Pancho.
Episode 2. I'm very, very excited about this episode because this was originally going to be our first episode of the show, but then we became so enthralled with gun violence and the Second Amendment that we felt the need to throw that in there first. And now we get to have this discussion, which I have been waiting almost a year to have with my dad. I've been wanting to talk about this topic, but I knew it was going to be an episode. So, Dad, since as long as I can remember, and I knew about politics, probably when I was 10 or 11 years old, you always had this weird flex that your entire voting life, you've only voted for two major party candidates, George McGovern and Barack Obama. Is that true?
That is 100% true. First thing I'll say is that when I was 18, I could not vote because at that time the voting age was 21.
I thought you were about to say because of, Voting Rights Act, you're maybe just past that, right?
Yeah, past that. So I would have, if the voting age had been 18, I would have voted, I would have been able to vote in 1968, which was Nixon against Humphrey. And I definitely would not have voted for Hubert Horatio Humphrey.
But you would have voted for your boy Richard Nixon, right?
Uh, hmm, no way. So you are correct. I have only voted for two major Democratic Party candidates. All of them, with the exception of George McGovern. I voted for him in 1972 because he was very strongly opposed to the war in Vietnam. And at that time, that was the major political issue of my concern. So after that, we had Jimmy Carter, Walter Mondale, Michael Dukakis, Bill Clinton, Al Gore, John Kerry. Then we got to Obama, and then there was Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, and now Kamala Harris.
Thank you for doing that rundown because I know all of those names, but certainly couldn't have recited them in order.
Oh, well, thank you. So I have not voted for any of those Democratic candidates because, from my perspective, they were too conservative, or I guess what you could call neoliberal. As you know, my politics are very far to the left, and all those candidates, not surprisingly, all those candidates were far too moderate for me. So I have always voted, with those exceptions, I have always voted for some third party. I have never considered it an option to not vote. I think it is one's duty in a democratic society to vote, and especially because of all the struggles in the civil rights movement to allow Black people to be able to vote. I have always felt that it was my duty as a citizen to cast my ballot.
Yeah, I think it's important to frame that context because even for me, I don't have an understanding of, direct institutional racism. And, you grew up in the 50s when, you, even if you were of age, you wouldn't have been allowed to vote. You wouldn't have been allowed to marry someone who was a different race. And of course, that ultimately happened later in your life. And so I just think it's such an interesting and something that should take a beat to recognize that in my father's lifetime, there was times when Black people couldn't vote or get married to other races, white people in particular.
So I would say Um, I think very often about the fact that given my age, if I had grown up in the South, I would have been dead a long time ago
Mm,
because I would have been involved in various civil rights activities. I'm sure I would have been arrested multiple times, and I would be surprised if I were alive. So I think about that a lot, and I'm very grateful to have grown up in New York City and not to have grown up in the South.
yeah.
On all those occasions, except the exceptions noted, I have voted for a third party. I've voted for different third parties. I voted for Ralph Nader. I've voted for Jill Stein. I've voted for the Socialist Workers Party. I'm sure I have probably voted for the Communist Party. Um, Whoever is on the ballot. That's one of the amazing things about presidential elections, that when you get your ballot, there are like 20 people listed
Right.
you can vote for. And if you,
17, 18 of which you've never heard
mm,
of most times.
most of the times that is true. And it's a real crime the way that candidates who are not Democrats or Republicans are treated by news outlets, whether print or on television. It seems to me that those people should be able to participate in presidential debates. How are you going to know to vote for, let's say, Jill Stein, unless you're able to read something about what her positions are? But of course, we know who owns the newspapers and television stations, and they don't want you to have that option. And so in this election, both Jill Stein and Cornel West are on the ballot. And most people are not going to have the opportunity to know anything about either of them. And I think that's a real undemocratic move.
I agree. I think it might just even be called the Committee on Presidential Debates or Political Debates, which is this bipartisan committee that, gatekeeps the debate process. And I know as we get a little bit later on, uh, we're just 2 days past the first and possibly only debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. And I'm sure we're both going to have lots of interesting takes on it. And I'm sure more or less anybody watching this probably either watched the debate live or have now been seeing the the memes and the clips from it. And yeah, to think that we have at least two other candidates that people are going to be voting for, that and Cornel West is a new candidate, but Jill Stein has been in the last 2, 3 elections. I'm sure there's millions of people who have no idea who she is.
Well, so this is how the conspiracy works. The people who are in charge of the debates, they say anybody can participate in a debate as long as they have at least, I think the number is 5% in polls.
Right.
Well, but if you don't get on TV and you don't get in the newspaper and nobody knows who you are, there's no chance that you're going to get 5% in the polls. So it's, they set this up to prevent people from really having a true democratic choice. And
I
they do
couldn't,
that deliberately.
yeah. And I couldn't agree more. And I always like to invoke the late, great Michael Rupert, who, if people don't know, was the LAPD detective who uh discovered that the CIA was selling cocaine in South Central Los Angeles to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. And what he says is that there is conspiracy theory and there's conspiracy fact. And so there's, of course, all sorts of crazy conspiracy theories, but there are also conspiracies that have happened that we have plenty of documents and evidence and documentation for. And so this, of course, is an instance that I would say what you just talked about is a conspiracy fact against third parties and opposition. Now,
And and it wasn't just one cop in Los Angeles. That was happening all over the country.
right,
And Ronald Reagan should have been impeached for doing that because he was violating the law by trying to overthrow a democratically elected president in Nicaragua.
right. Now, before we go too much farther, I cannot make too many assumptions, but I'm going to assume that most of our listeners are going to be voting for Kamala Harris in November. And I'm sure many of them would say, maybe not many of them, but I know people will say, because I have talked about this with friends when I talk about how I consider voting for third parties, and I actually never have. Every presidential election, I have held my nose and voted for the Democratic candidate. I was not old enough to vote for Obama in 2008, and I was very excited about that. But by the time 2012 came around, I was disillusioned, and I remember drinking quite a bit of alcohol and crying so that I could check his box because I knew that he was not the hope and change that he had once pretended to represent. So I have always been more or less guilted into compliance, let's say, other than in 2016, I wrote in Bernie Sanders rather than voting for Hillary. So the question that I know many people are thinking is, Jesse, Pancho, you are throwing your vote away to vote for a third party. Or worst case scenario, you are giving your vote to Trump. What say you to that?
To that, I say we both are incredibly lucky because we live in states that are solidly democratic, and there's no hope that Trump would win either California or Oregon. I have had the fortune of my entire life living in states that were solidly democratic. I live in Oregon. I have lived in New York, and I have lived in Massachusetts. And so, never a question of throwing my vote away or handing the vote to the Republican candidate. And to go back to what you said before when you were talking about Obama the second time, I too held my nose and voted for Obama the second time. I was very disappointed in him in that during his first term, he had control of both the House and the Senate, and he got very little done. And that was
Right.
very, very disappointing. And I think that it's a tragedy that in a democratic system like ours, one has to hold one's nose
Mm,
to vote. That should never be the case.
yeah, very much agree with that. And to reiterate to anyone watching who lives in Pennsylvania and Ohio and even like Texas and Arizona, please vote for Kamala Harris.
Exactly.
and
Exactly.
even and even if we have whatever millions of voters in others in very blue states, then maybe y'all can still vote for Kamala Harris too. But let's go a little bit deeper because obviously it's not just that. Clearly, you have or we have a particular political ideology that makes us not interested in right in voting for these major uh, parties. And as I think people can assume, there hasn't really ever been any question about voting for the Republican Party. But again, I'm sure many people here are pro-Democrat, think that the Democrats are trying to work within the system to make things better. It's diverse. It has, women, all of these things. So if you don't mind, Dad, can you talk a bit about some of your some of the reasons why you are not super enthused by the Democratic Party over, again, so many candidates? I mean, seems like Jimmy Carter probably did some like good stuff. Like what has
He did more good stuff after he was no longer president.
fair enough.
So, on the topic of Kamala Harris, why I'm not voting for her, and why I'm not supporting the Democratic Party in general. Her positions on at least three issues that I can think of, I don't support. One of the issues is healthcare. I
Mm,
believe that there should be universal free healthcare for everybody, and we should put the insurance companies out of business.
agreed.
She is not in support of that. A second issue has to do with environmental justice. She looked terrible in the debate when she was talking about fracking.
Right.
Fracking is totally screwed up and it causes significant harm to the environment. It increases the likelihood of earthquakes. And, you know, there's nothing good to be said about fracking. And she might try to make the argument about employment
Right.
that if fracking were stopped, lots of people would lose their jobs. That's the same lame ass argument that Joe Manchin uses in West Virginia to
Yeah.
talk about coal mining.
Right.
I mean, there are easy, quote unquote, easy solutions. You train the coal mine workers to do something else. And you
Right.
can do the same thing with people who work in fracking.
And we could go, this is something that we'll probably dedicate a whole issue to, is probably each of these individual topics because they're pretty clearly they're important for us. But yeah, there's, this reliance on fossil fuels that every year we go farther, the potentials of wind, solar, tidal, and geothermal energy
Well, we
are
can't
all
use we can't use wind because it causes cancer
right.
and it kills millions of birds, according to your boy, Mr. Trump.
Well, I think the bird thing is true, but
Bird thing probably is true.
but so do airplanes, so do glass
Exact,
doors,
exactly, exactly.
so do cats, as long as they're not being eaten in Dearborn.
Well, we'll get to that. The third issue, besides healthcare and the environment, the third reason that I am not voting for Harris and not supporting the Democratic Party in general is foreign policy. I am extremely upset and disappointed about the U.S. position in the Middle East, specifically rights for the Palestinians. And although she called for a ceasefire, that's talk and that's not action. The appropriate action would be to cease selling any weapons to Israel because the weapons that we give Israel are the weapons that are being used to kill those 40,000 plus people who have died. The blood of those people is on the US, is on Joe Biden, and is on Kamala Harris. And so I would never vote for a Democratic candidate who did not have a strong enough position on Palestinian rights.
Agreed. Yeah, 100%. That's certainly the big issue for me as well. And that's, I think, probably one that we'll do a deep dive on at some point as well. But to speak, briefly on it, I'm sure that you would agree that this is a struggle between oppressor and oppressed, an apartheid state,
Ab-
restricting the access to
Absolutely an
food and
apartheid
water.
state.
And yeah,
Yes. And building walls and making people have to have passes, um, and the Israeli government keeping the military. That's why we don't have a ceasefire, because Israel wants to keep troops in Gaza.
yeah,
And Hamas rightfully says, forget that. We're not going to allow you to keep occupying our territory.
right. and we can go and we can, of course, take a moment to be sensitive to the complexities of this issue. Of course, the atrocity that took place on October 7th and the unique position of Jewish people across the world having been so um, oppressed themselves even before the Holocaust, and of course, then the Holocaust. And so I just want to, of course, take a moment to say that we understand, and I think it's going to be a big thing on this program. We understand the nuance and complexity in all issues, and we can say on one side that October 7th was horrible, but that's not when this conflict started. It started much, much further back in history. And if you look at that history, the treatment of Palestinians compared to Israelis is not even close.
100% agreed. And we could go into a lot of detail on that particular issue, but I assume you want to save it for another show. I will just say, I agree with everything that you said. I am totally sympathetic to the plight that Jewish people experienced even before the Holocaust in Europe, and why the idea of a quote unquote Jewish homeland was an important idea. The complications become when you get to where that Jewish homeland was going to be located. It could have been anywhere on the globe.
Right. They were looking, it's a funny thing. I have, I'm a Pan-Africanist and have spent some time on that beautiful continent. And I imagine a lot of people don't know because I only found out recently that one of the big places they were thinking about before what is now Israel was Uganda. And now, of course, there's this whole, Judeo-Christian idea of Jerusalem and Bethlehem and all of the stuff related to Christ. And, again, these religious sites, it's Christ obviously is not big for the Jews, but there's the other, Temple Mount and
Let us remember that Jesus Christ was a Palestinian.
yeah, and a Jew, but yet Jewish people aren't too crazy about him. But that there's all these religious sites that are very important now, but that was not how Zionism started. They just wanted a place, and they were looking at Central Africa, which of course had no connection to Judaism or Christianity.
They were also looking in South America.
Mm.
So, yes, it could have been anywhere. It did not have to be in that specific place. And that's where the complications of religion come up, because one of the arguments that is attempted to be used is that this is the place where the Jewish homeland needs to be because, quote unquote, God gave us that land.
Right.
And
Your boy God.
my boy God. Well, actually, my boy God says in the book of Exodus, he says to the Hebrews, I am going to give you the land of the Canaanites, which means somebody else was there first. So that is a specious argument
Mm.
that Jews make, that they deserve that particular space because of religious history. I mean, their own book tells them that somebody else was there first. And interestingly enough, that's sort of the same kind of argument that got used in the United States for manifest destiny,
Absolutely.
that God gave us the right to stretch from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. Oh, there happen to be indigenous people, but they're in the way. So we'll just wipe them out, kill the buffalo, their source of food, clothing, housing, etc. And we'll just take over the land because God told us.
Yeah. Lots of great thoughts of how we can, we could go hours on each of these topics, but we're currently focused on Kamala Harris. So I think we've at least given a good teaser for the uh Middle East piece, but I'm sure there's maybe one other foreign policy position. Oh no, just kidding. I it seems as though I haven't done tons and tons of research, that the Biden administration has done a decent job in Ukraine, but that's of course another big topical foreign policy
They
issue.
have not done as much as they should have done. So, for example, they are giving missiles to Ukraine, but they are not giving permission for longer range missiles,
Hmm,
which I think that Ukraine needs in order to combat the attacks from Russia and your boy Putin.
right. Well, what I was starting to say was that's something you disagree with entirely, but of course that's, you know, they could do better and maybe aren't doing enough, but that's not, you being fundamentally opposed to what they're doing, like your position on Israel and Palestine. So we talked about the environment, we talked about foreign policy, we talked about healthcare. Are there any other issues with Harris specifically and the Democratic Party in general?
Um, I think that actually that's enough issues to not vote for somebody.
Fair.
You know, I mean, healthcare and the environment and foreign policy are gigantic issues. I did like what she said in the debate about women's healthcare rights. I thought that that was one of the most moving moments when she talked about women having miscarriages and having to bleed out in their cars in the parking lot because doctors won't allow them to come into the hospital because they might get charged with murder if um, they're helping a woman who is miscarrying.
Right.
And Trump, as usual, was disgusting on that topic,
Yeah. And I think,
as he was on every other topic.
of
You know,
course,
his his um his answer, he didn't directly answer any question that was asked of him, and he tried to turn every question into an answer about immigration. And then he kept saying the same thing over and over and over again. Millions of people are coming here. They've let them out of jails. They've let them out of mental hospitals. And they're taking away Black jobs.
right.
No, I mean, ridiculous and disgusting. And
What is,
and
wait, what is a black job? Is he saying that illegal immigrants are going to be in the NBA, or what is a black job?
how about president?
Right.
That's a Black job. That would be cool.
Hell yeah.
One of the problems on the topic of immigration, this is I fault both the Republicans and Democrats on this. People only look at the end. It's like what we were talking about in terms of the Middle East. They act like the problem began on October 7th. And how did we get to October 7th? What happened leading up to that day? The same thing is true on the topic of immigration. People from Mexico and Honduras and Guatemala and Nicaragua, they don't want to come and live in the United States. They are leaving their country and trying to come here because of the shitty conditions in their home country. You want to stop quote unquote illegal immigration, then help those countries deal with the problems that are existing in their home country. Everybody loves their own country and would like to live and stay there. They don't want
Right.
to have to pack up and go someplace else. And the only reason people are doing that is because there are terrible conditions in their home country.
And we could talk about the terrible conditions generally, but unfortunately, and I'm pretty sure every country you named, if you dig a little deeper, those issues are going to run into US colonialism and extracting the wealth and resources from those countries so that they don't have economies that can compete with ours.
And not only extracting the wealth, going back to the issue of democracy, there's a whole bunch of countries that have elected presidents who are too far left for the US. Chile, Grenada, Guatemala, Iran.
Mm,
We, with the help of the CIA, overthrew democratically elected presidents in all of those countries. And what happens after that? Right wing fascists take over. And they take over in order to, quote unquote, protect American resources. And those people, when they get into office, they end up exploiting the people in their countries. And that's why those people want to leave.
yeah, it's
And
such
we
a
illegally have the CIA help in that process.
right. And in some, pretty sinister ways as well, we have, and it's, to come back to this, let me take a small step back. There's this sort of position I feel now that there is this separation between recent history and current history, and so many people just don't seem to understand how very recently many politicians were slimy as hell, saying stuff that you couldn't dream of saying now. I think about your boys Nixon and Kissinger openly talking about how speaking from a eugenicist position, that Latin Americans were racially inferior and needed to be kept in line, and that they, even though they democratically elected a leader, that they more or less weren't smart enough to know what was good for them. And yeah, these open recorded conversations in the Oval Office talking about how to best overthrow these dictators. And in most cases, it was economics, sending in economic hitmen, oftentimes with ties to the CIA, to go in and start labor strikes or general economic unrest, which then sets up an environment for coups and assassinations.
Yes, and the reason for all of that is US imperialism, that it
Exactly.
has gone into those various countries and controlled what was the source of wealth for the country. So to take just one obvious example, in Chile, the biggest source of revenue was copper mines, and the copper mines were owned by the US. And so when Allende became president, he nationalized the copper mines and didn't give recompense to the US. And so as a result, the US got pissed off. Same thing happened in Cuba.
Mm.
Fidel nationalized things that had belonged to the US, and the US was pissed off and then decided to respond militarily.
And this is actually a thank you for that, because this is a point I've really wanted to make, that there's a lot of people, um often now it's sort of this movement of like the libertarian folks, but it's not just them. But there's a lot of people who think the core issue, where you and I say that it's economic and market capitalism that is the root of these other issues. A lot of people like to say that the state is the root of these issues. And I would argue that you take one of these examples, and the issue, like you said, is US imperialism. It's not the government, it's that US businesses have gone into these countries and seized the means of production to extract this wealth. And as soon as the host country says, you're taking all this money and giving it back to the US while our people are starving and dying in the streets, we're taking this back for ourselves. That is the moment when the US government then gets involved and says, we need to protect our business interests. So I just thought that that was an
And
important
that, and
point to make.
that's because those businesses own politics,
Exactly. Not the other way around.
not the other way around. We've solved all the problems in the world now.
Well, and I think this is precisely the time where we do, in every episode, talk about a not so rosy situation happening in the world. But as we discussed last time, we are both deeply optimistic. It's a cornerstone of your philosophy as an educator that you need to feel that there is a way out of this. So you're not voting for Harris. Let's talk about some of the benefits of either a specific third party or why you think there needs to be one, or at least just something a little bit less dreary than, you know, assassinations and coups d'etats.
There have been third parties all along. As far as I know, the founding fathers didn't particularly strongly believe in political parties, and they certainly didn't believe that political parties should be limited to two.
Mm.
And look at how we have deteriorated. Now people vote. I mean, this sort of gets us to talking about Trump. After all the things that he has done, he is a rapist. He is a racist. He has been found guilty on 34 felony counts with more to come. How could anybody in their right mind think that he is fit to be president of the United States, especially anybody who is a person of color or anybody who is middle class or working class? The only thing that he has done is come up with tax cuts for the rich. And I mean, sometimes I think people are stupid. Every Republican has used that sort of George Bush trickle down idea. You give tax cuts to the wealthy, they're going to make more money, and they're going to take that more money and increase the wages for their workers.
The job creators.
They never do that. They put the money in their pockets. And okay, once a Republican says that, and you might believe it, but then when you see what they actually did, why would you ever vote for a Republican again? There is no Republican ever in recent history who has actually made life better for the working classes.
I think that's such a key point. There's two things I want to take out of that. One, it's the purpose of us doing this program that we have very much identified that the education in this country is steering people to literally vote against their best interests. Tax cuts for the wealthy do not benefit the masses of people who, you know, what was he saying in the debate? 80 million people who voted for him? You know,
Right.
what is there? A few thousand that benefit from those tax cuts, but the large
Exactly.
majority that screwed them over. I did love that Kamala was trying to harness the kind of simple speech that Trump has made so famous for himself. So, and tying things to him, it's funny. People, and they've done polls on this, people don't have an issue with the Affordable Care Act, but they sure do hate Obamacare.
Correct.
And
And
so, same,
interestingly enough, Trump has had the opportunity to do something different slash better, and he hasn't. And when pressed about it during the debate, he said, I have an idea, I have a plan. but he
I
didn't
have a
say
I
what
have
it
a I have a
was.
concept of a
A
plan.
concept of a plan, which isn't even a fucking plan.
Right.
He has done nothing. But I don't think that the ultimate issue is about economics. I
Mm,
think that the ultimate issue is about race. Working class white people are not getting anything from Trump's tax cuts to the wealthy. So then why would they vote for Trump? They're voting for Trump because the country is getting more brown and white folks are scared about what's going to happen. And they know that they'll forget about Trump's racism, they'll forget about Trump's misogyny, but they continue to support him because of his belief in white supremacy and their belief in white supremacy. They are afraid of what's going to happen when we, quote unquote, take over.
right.
And oh my God, what if we did to them what they've been doing to us for 400 years? And so
Exactly.
that's why they will continually vote for somebody like Trump.
I, and to say it a different way, because I think we ultimately agree. What I was trying to get at was, to use your example, racism is a construct and an outgrowth of the system in order to preserve the system, the competitive advantage to the people at the top. Racism was not a thing. There's all sorts of like anthropological evidence talking about how uh before chattel slavery, which people, myself included, forgot, there was people, in the US before like really intense slavery started in 1619, right? We have, decades where black people and white people and native people were working together. It's actually, this is a point that I love, that there's writings speaking about Native Americans who literally didn't know that black people and white people were different because they dressed the same, they had the same customs, etc. It was only when there was a need or an opportunity to create this racial caste system. And I think, sort of exactly to what you were getting at, that if working class indentured white European indentured servants and African slaves got together, well, all of a sudden, all those plantation owners are going to be shaking in their boots. And so they needed to create animosity between these two massive groups of people in order to continue to perpetuate this system of oppression on the masses.
And that is the truth to this day. If the white working class and the black working class realized that they're both getting equally screwed by the rich white dudes, could change the world. So
Exactly.
in order to, and the people on top know that. And so they use things like race to keep the two groups separated from each other
Yeah,
because they know that if those two groups got together, they would be out on their ass in a second.
exactly. And I think it's interesting that for you, your issues with the Democratic Party were macro level political issues, whereas I would argue the large majority of people in this country vote on social wedge issues, abortion, being on one side or the other on that, gay marriage being on one side or the other on that, these social issues that I would assume people at the very top don't even care about, but they have, they want that to be what people talk about rather than talking about the environment, talking about foreign policy, talking about capitalism and how we need to guarantee people food, water, shelter, love, and social inclusion. And until we do that, we're going to continue to see the system harness these divisive social issues, manufacturing them, in fact, in order to keep the masses fighting each other instead of fighting the system.
Well, and don't forget, there's good people on both sides.
Exactly. I want to say something about that because I have been we both watched the debate a couple nights ago, and I am actually feeling really optimistic. Though I'm not, as we know, voting for Kamala Harris, I am actually much more excited and enthusiastic about her campaign than I thought I was going to be. And one quick example is that is just seeing the deterioration of Trump in real time. Felt like I was watching The Wizard of Oz and the curtain is being pulled back, and instead of this big green scary face, it's this small man in a little booth. And that anytime she said anything a little bit personal, the example I liked is that she said, "Go to one of Trump's rallies and you'll see people exhausted and bored leaving early." And rather than talking, I don't even remember what issue they were talking about. Um, and neither did Trump because he had to spend so much time trying to argue with her, having a tantrum about no one leaves my rallies, or she doesn't even have rallies. They have to fly people in, just all of the stuff. So you could just see him throwing a tantrum, and it just felt really nice. I felt a little bit gaslit almost the last um what is it, 8 years almost since 2016. I remember when The Apprentice came out, and that was sort of the first time I became acquainted with Donald Trump. And for lack of better terms, I remember being a young kid saying, "Who the fuck is this guy? He is one of the worst examples of a human being I can think of." And that millions of people got behind him and voted for him is just so sad to me. But I am pretty optimistic that it is going to be a landslide victory for Kamala Harris, especially because all of those criminals flying across our border by the millions are going to be voting for her.
I'm going to agree and disagree.
I love it.
On the one hand, I totally agree that Harris is going to completely crush Trump in terms of the number of votes. He lost last time by 8 million votes. I expect he will lose by an even greater number this time around. But there is the screwed up problem that we have of the Electoral College. Now, we
Oh,
are the only major country in the world that has a system with something like the Electoral College. In every other place, the person who wins the most votes is the person who wins the election. And that's why elections are so close in this country because of the screwed upness of the Electoral College.
right.
So that's number one. Number two, even if Harris wins the election, the votes still have to be certified.
Mm,
And there are lots of states in which the person who is in charge of making that certification is a Trump person.
right.
And so we could have another January 6th on our hands. Although, interestingly enough, uh, we don't have to worry about whether Mike Pence is going to do the right thing in Congress because Harris will not only be president elect, she will also still be vice president. And
Right.
so she will be in charge of the voter certification.
Yeah, that's what I've been thinking about too, is there might be issues, but I mean, if you are a Trump person watching this, I implore you to not do anything in the terms of rioting, because the big thing about J6 is that it was Trump in charge of the National Guard and all of those things. And so J6 was able to be, it seems, at least to me, somewhat of a inside job, or maybe not quite an inside job, but that there was a severe lack of security. If people try and do that with an outgoing Biden to an incoming Harris, it is not going to be pretty. It's going to be lots of folks going to jail, lots of, you know,
Well,
issues
that's what
there.
this election is about. Ultimately, is Trump trying to stay out of jail
Right.
because he knows that when Harris becomes president, that is going to change the case in Florida. That's going to change the case in Georgia. That's going to change the case in DC. Trump is going to be convicted in all three, and he is going to spend most likely the rest of his life in jail.
Mm,
And so for him, he knows that. And so he's going to do anything he possibly can do in order to keep his ass out of jail.
right.
And going back to it was a nice plea to any Republicans watching this. I think that something that's called radicals, I don't think too many Republicans are going to be watching what we're doing.
Well, that brings me to a point of yours that I didn't address, which was you, for lack of better terms, referring to some of these people as a basket of deplorables. To quote your girl Hillary Clinton. I do not quite see it that way. I mean, I understand that there is quite a correlation between level of education and likelihood to vote left or right, as in the more highly you are educated, the much more likely you are to vote Democrat. However, I can understand, and I think there's going to be more radicals in this camp than maybe you think for this one reason. One of the things Trump was able to harness, yes, he has harnessed racism and xenophobia, but he has also harnessed a radical anti-establishment idea that is, like he said, draining the swamp. That mainstream politics, mainstream media, right? Some of, uh, a broken clock is right 2 times a day. He has identified some things that he's been correct about, that the mainstream media is biased. And so all of that is to say there were a number of people, particularly in 2016, much less so now, I understand, but certainly in 2016, there were a slew of people who were pro Bernie, pro Trump, because they were able to identify that this system is unsustainable, that they have, a shitty blue collar job and can't afford healthcare or education or that fancy car that their neighbor has, whatever it might be. Relative poverty is one of the most destructive issues. If you see all of your neighbors with nice cars and nice clothes, and you can afford your food and your water, but you can't afford the things. One example of that, right? As someone who's a teacher, the the amount of money that black people spend on sneakers, right? Because there's this whole thing, especially in schools where you have uniforms, your sneakers are your only way to express yourself. And it's not that all of these kids are wearing sneakers that they like. They're wearing sneakers that are a symbol of status, that they can afford the fancy Jordans. And if you can't, if you have the FUBUs, then you're getting made fun of. And that's a huge thing. So anyway, to bring it back to the point, I think there were, at least at a time, many pro-Trump people who were for Trump for the radical reason that they see that the system isn't working, and Trump was promising to change that, to drain the swamp. Obviously, he didn't do that, but that was a
Yeah, I
argument he
mean,
made.
I see that argument. I also want to point out that there's a huge hypocrisy in that. So they're saying, the government is corrupt and Trump is going to come in and fix the government and he's going to eliminate and, as you said, drain the swamp. And then you have people like your boy Ron DeSantis in Florida who will agree with all that stuff. Government is the problem. We got to make government smaller, whatever. But then when there's a hurricane, he's on his knees begging the government to come in and help.
I think Ron DeSantis might be your boy because you brought up that exact same point last week as well.
Well, I don't want to forget about Ron DeSantis.
I hear you. There's certainly, that can come back to the education piece that maybe some of these issues that people are worked out about, they don't have the full context of. But I would stand pretty firmly on them at least identifying that the system isn't working. And here's somebody who's not a politician who says funny things, which I have never once laughed at anything Trump has ever said. But people do. I guess I have to admit that people think he's funny. But he was promising to completely, radically change the system and help, working class, conveniently mostly white people.
Yeah, agreed. Another example of that is Biden's infrastructure bill that created lots of jobs, going to help fix highways and bridges, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Every Republican votes against it,
Right.
even though it's going to help the people in their districts. And then after the bill passes and they voted against it, they're going to go out and give a speech and take credit for it.
Right.
Like, my people, I helped you. Yeah. How did you help me? By voting against a bill that's going to help me.
Yeah. Yeah, that is definitely a huge issue. And I think, at least for me, it's one of my big goals with this program is to talk about these issues and a wide range of issues so that people can understand it's not left versus right. It's not black versus white. It is us against the system. And yes, there's going to be people who are such beneficiaries of the system, right? Shouldn't be lost on anyone that Donald Trump is a millionaire or billionaire, whatever he is. He is this, the system benefits him so much. He doesn't understand the plight of working people. He pretends to and gives lip service to it, but he wants the system to continue more than anybody else because his entire life he has had a silver spoon hanging from his mouth. And so we need to be focused on educating people to recognize that, yeah, these little issues, yes, we want to be able to go to our local church if that's what you want to do. We want to be able to feel safe in our homes. We want to be able to afford the basic necessities of life. But the reason these things are problems is because of the system that we live under, not because of these other social issues that we quibble about most of the time.
And you were correct to refer to Trump's silver spoon in his mouth. But let's not also forget that it was a racist silver spoon because his daddy would not allow Black people to live in the apartment buildings that
Right.
he owned. So Trump grew up with racism as one of his fundamental beliefs, and he has continued to exercise those beliefs.
Couldn't agree more. But I think it has come to be that time. I hope.
It has come to be that time, and I'm getting a little hungry, so I might wanna have a little dog for lunch.
Well, I heard they make the best in Michigan.
Yeah.
Oh man. So yeah, I hope that those of you who have joined us have learned a thing or two and have maybe smiled once or twice. And in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, the curse of poverty has no justification in our age. It is socially as cruel and blind as the practice of cannibalism at the dawn of civilization, when men ate each other because they had not learned to take food from the soil or to consume the abundant animal life around them. The time has come for us to civilize ourselves by the total, direct, and immediate abolition of poverty. Our song of the week is Mississippi Goddamn by Nina Simone. For Jesse and Pancho, today is September 12th, 2024. Thank you so much for joining us on Radicals with Age, and we will see you after a while.